So this is a video for when you are done gridding out your project, you have your grid lines erased and you're ready to paint. You should have your project, a paper towel, paintbrush, a good amount of paint, your primary colors in white and black, and then just a little water cup. And then you're ready to begin. I like starting with the background personally. I can leave edges a little bit rougher. It's not as important to have clean details, so I kind of make it a little messy because it's kind of my style, but you can see how I blend my white and my blue. I thought that the dark blue was too dark, so I start adding in that white. And if you paint quickly, you can blend it right on your paper, which kind of creates a fun texture if you like that. So I start out with that background. Like you can see, I have really rough edges because then I can let them dry and then I paint over them. And I find that to be the easiest way to have clean edges on the actual detailed parts of your project. Now, if you notice, I painted the top side and then I painted the bottom side, but I kept that top side away from me because I didn't want to put my arm in the paint. And by also painting both sides, I'm also keeping that habit, and then I go on to the next thing. So I practice painting and getting kind of some of that color on my printout, just to make sure that everything looks good before I put it on my project. So I kind of decided that just plain white wasn't going to work since I knew that Pegasus was going to be plain white. So I thought yellow next to that blue, just a soft yellow would kind of add a nice touch. But once again, kind of just mixing it in as we go because they are clouds. And so it kind of creates a little bit of that wispy effect. And I also think it kind of makes it seem more Mount Olympus, or Greek god kind of feel to it with that gold hint to it. So you can kind of see how I create some of that wispiness by continuing to work quickly. I allow some of that blue to mix in, and so that's why I didn't let it dry completely because I wanted that wispy effect in my background. Now, if that's something you don't want, then you want to make sure that you are letting that background dry entirely before you paint that next layer. But I decided that with that wispy effect that I want some, I use some blue water in there. I use a little bit more of that gold, and I allow things to mix a little bit more because that's the style that I was going for. Something you might find is kind of that if you look at that dry brush on the right side there, if you want to try and get rid of that and you want smooth edges, sometimes all it takes is just a little bit of water. Sometimes it takes a little bit more paint. In my case here, it was just a little bit of water, but you do want to make sure that you're not watering it out too much that you can see through the paint. But by adding just a little bit, it can kind of help smooth out that paint a little bit, which allows for neater edges. So my bases are done. Now I need to clean up. I want everything to dry on there entirely before I move on. So I always clean up by kind of putting on a good layer of water over the paint that's on the table. And then once all that's on there, then you just take a dry paper towel to it. Now you'll find some colors are a little bit more difficult to clean up than others. So sometimes you need to go back over that. So now I'm ready to move on. My bases have dried entirely since I've let them dry overnight, and then I kind of start on to the base layers of my more detailed pieces. So I don't want to paint the outlines and then have to try and paint the white around them, so I just paint everything white. Now with a thin coat of white, I'll actually be able to see my pencil line through. So I just paint it everywhere. And then that way I know where my outlines are going to be later on, but I don't have to work as hard. So you can see kind of how I mix in my colors. I'm not mixing a ton, especially like with areas like this. You really, it's remarkable at how much a little bit of paint can go. So be courteous with your paint. Don't mix big piles of it because you really don't need it. But go through, and then sometimes you'll find, like I find out here, that I don't like the size brush that I'm working with. And so you can always switch out your brush. Sometimes if you're doing thin, smooth, detailed lines, you need something smaller, and that's fine. Sometimes this is where that adding a little bit of water adds quite a bit to your painting as well, because you do get nice smooth lines. But biggest technique with creating smooth lines too is just having long brush strokes instead of having short, jagged ones. So different techniques that you'll find as you go along. Notice what I do here with the tail. Instead of painting it just blue, I actually add a little bit of dark blue, and I end up adding a little bit of that light gray, so it actually all kind of helps everything tie together. So once I have one side done, I go on to the other side and repeat the entire process. Now, another technique you can do is when your paint is dry, is you can do something that is called glazing with your artwork. And so you can see that I do this here for the wings. And so I have just a little bit of paint mixed up, and then you just add a lot of water. And so you're essentially creating a washed out effect. And so you can still see that color underneath. So I still have that white showing through, but it just creates that lighter gray without having to mix a lighter gray, and I can still see the wing lines through. So this is called glazing that you can always do. Now I start to mix here a color for my jack and my diamond, and I was kind of like, oh, I don't really like this purple. I didn't think it popped out enough, and so then I'm like, you know, let's try something totally different. And I went with this color instead. So keep in mind that you can't always change those colors. Even if you paint, you can always let it dry and paint over it with a different color if it doesn't look right. And you'll see me do that here a couple times. But I thought that this yellowish orangish worked actually pretty well because it tied in with the clouds. I can add some of those details in, and it just kind of adds a little bit more fun. So I bring that purple over to this diamond, but then that's too dark, and so then I add that lightness, add that extra layer, and it just kind of helps it pop out just a little bit more. So just another thing that you can keep in mind as you're working through this. Now, sometimes you'll either paint over details that maybe you can't see, or you decide to add in details. Now, for me, I did not trust myself to paint this before drawing it. So if your paint is dry, you can always draw on top of it, and you can actually use that as another guide. So I do that for this little pattern here, and sometimes you can freehand it, but if you don't trust yourself, then this is always a good backup. So you can see a couple different ways that I've tried to tie my artwork in together. So I wasn't planning on putting the little swirl inside the diamond, but then I wanted to bring that orange up there, bring that pattern up there. I just felt like it made the painting more unified. I added white because I thought that that orange wasn't quite enough. And now I am working towards, I decided to try and add in these white dots. I'm like, little ones didn't look good, so then I decided to make big ones, and then I'm like, these just don't look good. So I kind of paint over them a little bit, just so it's easier to cover up, but then I just decide I'm just not going to do that. And so I find a more simplistic way, because I just felt like that area just needed a little extra something. So I actually bring in that orange, that darker one, and just outline the jack, and then that way I can paint over that area, the purple, just to fix that up and go back to normal. And then I just outline that jack, and then we're good to go. So best of luck. Get creative. If you don't like something, change it. Just let it dry and change it. That's the beauty of paint. So enjoy.